Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mining Insight. I'm your host, Matlagonolo Mashile, and today we dive into a world where leadership isn't just about boardrooms or balance sheets. It's about life and death. Joining us today is the CEO of the Mine Rescue Services, an organization that stands between disaster and survival in some of the most dangerous working environments. We are here at the training site where he talks to us about what it takes to lead in this high-stakes environment and some of the lessons that come from operating where failure simply isn't an option. Before we go right in, please remember to subscribe, like, and leave us a comment. You can also financially support the channel by clicking on the Super Thanks button. This helps us keep bringing you quality content. Having said all of that, let's meet our guest. Manus Fourie is the CEO of Mine Rescue Services, one of the most vital and respected organizations in South African mining. A man who learned this industry from the ground up, rising deliberately through the ranks as a miner, shift boss, mine overseer, section manager, mine manager, and general manager, accumulating decades of hard-earned wisdom at every level of the industry. He leads a team built on courage, precision, and self-service, showing up without hesitation when lives hang in the balance. In today's episode, Manus shares the story of Proto, what it truly takes to lead in high-stakes environments, the challenges facing mine rescue, and the leadership lessons that only come from a life spent in the service of others. Manus, great to have you with us. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's start with your journey into mining and for sure your way into Mine Rescue Services as a CEO.
So yes, I actually started mining many years ago, I think 94, 93, where I started at the old President Steyn mine in the Welkom region as a learner official. So I never knew from there I would ever sit where I'm sitting today, but it was a good journey for me in the mining industry. I went through the ranks. I wasn't as fortunate to be sent for studies, so I had to do it the hard way, of which I'm glad I did, because I went through being a miner, actually started as a laborer underground. You know, when you go through that training phase, you actually do everything that's happening at the mine. And then from there, I grew myself to miner, shift boss, mine overseer, section manager, underground manager, general manager, until I got to an executive position. So it was quite quick throughout my career. But yes, the mining industry I enjoyed, drilling and blasting. That's what I did for more than 30 years.
Sure. Then the transition into Proto and just growing up to be, at the helm of this organization.
So during this time as well, I had the opportunity to join as a rescue team member for Mines Rescue Services those years. And I joined the brigade and served for 5 years, of which during that time I also captained some of the rescue teams. And I think that was the foundation when this opportunity came out and the position was advertised for CEO for Mines Rescue Services. I had to grab it immediately to say, this is what I want to do. I still had a passion for the mines rescue and the Proto. But unfortunately, if you grow during your mining career, you need to decide, are you fully on mine management, doing what you have to do, or you want to do Proto? So that was a sad time to leave the brigade, but it had to be done to grow myself as a mining executive.
Sure. For those who don't know, how did the Mine Rescue Services come about? And how does the name Proto feature into the whole thing? Because I know in the industry, MRS and Proto are oftentimes used interchangeably. How did this organization come about?
So the organization is Mines Rescue Services South Africa. It was established in 1924 by the mining industry. So the mines came together and they said, if something happened, surely there was a couple of disasters that happened during those years, and there were not resources that could deal with it. So the mining industry got together then to say that we need to set something in South Africa. If there's incidents or disasters at the mine, these guys can be called upon and we can then respond accordingly. So they themselves as the industry decided, this is the organization we need to set. And fortunately, more than 100 years later, we're still in existence of serving the mining industry. So we have been involved in major incidents and disasters over the years. I mean, the Vaal Reef disaster, Tlobanical explosions. We've seen everything, and it's quite nice as an organization for us to be having this knowledge to attend to all these incidents. So if there's an incident at the mine, You know, it might be the first incident for that manager in control or that manager in office,
Sure.
where we can then step in and say, we've got all this knowledge, we have dealt with it before, this is the guidance we can give you during this incident.
Talking about that, mine rescue work is always a race against time with no margin for error. What systems and processes and even people should be in place to ensure that when that call comes, the work is carried out efficiently and safely? Because, I mean, there's no method of rescue that is scripted.
Yeah. What you just touched on it, there's no book.
Yes.
Mines rescue services, you know, if you go and study mining, there's plenty of books that can teach you ventilation, rock engineering, all the different divisions, but in mines rescue, there's none. So we have learned over the years what to do and when to do it. So we're fortunate, we've got 4 offices spread across South Africa, one in Carletonville, which is also our main office. This office serves the Carletonville region and the Platinum Belt in the Rustenburg area. And then I've got a station in Steelpoort that covers those mines. And then I've got a station in Evander that's doing the coal mines, and one in Welkom that looks after the gold fields and also the Northern Cape area. And then we're in the process of looking of establishing an office in the Northern Cape. So we try to be within 2 hours drive from most of our mines. So there's a whole setup of things that needs to be in place to make sure that we're effective and efficient. With that being said, we're also governed by the Mine Health and Safety Act, Chapter 16, of which requires if you have a mining license and you mine, you need to belong to a mines rescue services provider. In that, it also stipulates that if you have more than 150 people underground, you need to have your own rescue teams on site, of which we then train 4 times a year to make sure that they're competent and capable to deal with any scenario. If you have less than 150 people underground, you also need to subscribe to Mines Rescue Services. You just don't need to have your own teams. But if there's an incident, you can call me, and through Mines Rescue Services, we can call upon any mines teams and deploy at your mine to go and assist you.
Sure. Let's look at the 2 devastating incidents in the industry that has really took attention, and that's, you know, the current situation at the Ikapa mine where 5 miners are trapped underground, and reflecting back for 10 years at the Lily mine disaster where 3 miners are still trapped underground to date. When you look at the challenges and similarities between these 2 incidents, what challenges exist that are similar between the 2?
I don't foresee that there's any similarities between the 2. I mean, everyone has got their own unique challenges, which prevails when something like this happens. So with the Lily disaster, they had their own challenges, and the current one, which we're having in Ikapa, has got their own challenges. And I don't see the one at Ikapa to be rated the same as the Lily one, because we're still busy there, we're still doing all efforts, and I don't foresee it impossible to get to this position. So at one stage, you need to realize that whatever you're putting in place, are you going to risk more people and sacrifice more people, or are you going to draw a line to say that it's just too unsafe using the methodologies that we do have and the resources available? So currently at Ikapa, from what we see and where we are, we're taking out water. Thereafter, we're going to start loading the mud. And as that, we will progress up to the positions where we expect the people to be so that we can at least recover the bodies for family closure.
Currently, with the Ikapa situation, as you say, what is the rescue team currently doing besides pumping to ensure that once the water levels drop down, we are sure to recover the people and the hope as well? Are we looking at this to happen sooner?
Unfortunately, we can't do anything until the water has subsided. There's vast amount of water behind the mud, and it's pushing out on 2 sides on the horizontal level of the mine at the bottom level. And we have loaded a lot of, or pumped a lot of water. We wanted to start with loading, but then the water still pushes out on the other side of the mine, of which we have to pump. And as long as water is coming out, we cannot take the risk of starting to load because there might be secondary mud rushes happening. At the end of the day, we also need to make sure the team that's doing the work needs to be safe. We did drill holes from the top level into that mine on the elevation where we expected people to be. And unfortunately, we found those holes to be filled with water when we withdrew the rods. So yes, it just shows that there's a lot of water that has to be pumped. Unfortunately, it's a process. There's no shortcuts. You need to take it step for step to get where you want to be.
Particularly if you want to make it safely. When we look at, risks such as flooding, rock burst or rock failures, gas fires and explosions, these are the main hazards in the mining industry. How do we better prepare ourselves for such incidents? Should they happen? I mean, first prize is no incident happens, but should they happen, do you think there is more that we need to do proactively to ensure that our response is equipped and better?
Yeah, look, you always want to avoid this. And I think the mines have got good policies, procedures, systems of work and standards in place. But yes, unfortunately, sometimes we always get caught off guard and these things do happen. I must say, from what we know and what we've seen, we've done everything and put everything in place to make sure that the industry is covered and ready. But I can also assure you, after every incident, there's like an autopsy being done on this incident to see what else do we have to put in place? How are we going to change our measures? So we learn still up until today after every incident, and we do put things in place to make sure that we can be more effective and efficient when these incidents occur.
When you respond to rescue work involving illegal mining, which you've done multiple times, you're not just responding to rescue or recovery, you are dealing with criminology that is involved in the whole environment. How do you navigate that part? And I want you to perhaps speak on the Stilfontein work that you've done that has really was characterized by illegal mining and criminology. How do you navigate that situation?
Yeah, look, we're gonna be dealing with that still in the future, and it's not something that's gonna go away overnight. Illegal mining is an issue; it's a reality. We need to face it. But there's an aspect to it that a lot of people in the public out there don't know. You know, people sometimes comment without having the full picture and story about it. It is a very complex situation. Illegal mining. It's not just there's illegal miners. You know, some instances you need to go and evaluate to understand what the dynamics are. Some instances, a lot of those persons working there was not even aware that they're going to be involved in illegal mining. They get brought into the country, they get promised work at our mines, and when they arrive here, you know, their travel documentation gets taken and they get said, there you go, this is illegal mining, you're going to go and mine and work. And if you don't do it, we either throw you down the mine or we shoot around you or we shoot somebody, and then people do what they have to do. So, you know, it's a kid of a mother and a father and a family sometimes, which needs to go back and needs to be taken out. So that's the reason why sometimes we pursue to take the illegal mining out. It is a complex situation, like I said, and you need to assess every incident that happened on the ground and the situation when you get there. You can quickly see whether it's volatile or whether the people wants to work together with you. But I must say, people, especially the illegal miners, have been supportive towards Mines Rescue Services whenever we come there, because they know we're a beacon of help. If we're not going to help them, nobody else will be able to help them. We have had incidents where we had to walk away, where we could not assist as far as possible. But most of the incidents, these guys work together with us, and they support towards what we're doing to get them out.
Even the work that you did at the Stilfontein incident, there was extraordinary level of innovation that was involved in. I'm talking about your mobile rescue winder. How do you even prepare your team? Because it was the first of its kind. How do you prepare your team to function so efficiently in a situation they've never even been part of?
Yeah. I think there's two things to it. First of all, we had to have the technology of which we identified in the mining industry. Our shafts are aging. I mean, if you sit with a shaft that's got a shaft disaster, how do you assist? The equipment was designed to deal with emergencies, not to hoist out bulk shift from underground. And we never ever had the opportunity to deploy this winder successfully on the magnitude of people that we had to pull out during this incident. We used it before in one or two incidents where we had to go and take out illegal miners that fell down the shaft. But as you understand, a mine is operational 24 hours a day. So we haven't got our own mines, and whenever we want to test this equipment, I always beg and borrow from the mining industry to say, please give me a vertical shaft, I want to go testing in between your production, which is not easy.
It's not possible.
But they have, because they know this is important to the industry. And we got this winder working. And then secondly was the team of which we trained. We identified specific teams throughout South Africa's mining industry that has got hoist drivers, onsetters, specialized engineering skills. And we assign them to this winder. And on a quarterly basis, we take this winder out for legal inspection. And then we also conduct training on these teams. So you also asked previously, what do we do? How do we navigate? You know, when things happen like this, the hard work was done before.
For sure.
You need to make sure those teams are properly trained, skilled, equipped. It needs to be legit.
Yeah.
At that time, there's nothing which you can do where you're going to learn anybody anything. You need to depend on what you have painted them before the incident. And that's what assisted during the Stilfontein. The guys knew what to do. It was, you didn't have to tell them touch here, leave here. They just deployed, they opened up, and they went down to go and take these people out. So the team delivered that day.
Manus, are there moments where you, as the CEO, receive a call for a rescue work or recovery, perhaps, and you've got to make that executive decision that while you recognize the value you could contribute, but you conclude that this is too dangerous to deploy, or perhaps in an active operation where things deteriorate significantly and you've got to retreat? Have you had those, and what kind of decisions goes into, making those bold decisions?
Yeah, look, it's not nice decisions to be made.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, you need to weigh up how many people are at stake, what is the risk of them being rescued or recovered, and then you need to look at your team to see where you're going to draw the line. I must say, and we have extreme appetite for risk if there are people alive of which we can save.
I know.
It goes around that we say that we will risk our lives to save a life, and we have done it. Sadly, we've lost 41 of our members over the 100 years in existence, where people has pushed them beyond the boundaries for duty. But if I do see that it's impossible or that there is a recovery, we do take a different approach. And then those decisions needs to be made to say where we're going to go with this.
Sure, and you've just mentioned that you've lost about 41 lives, and the reality is rescuers themselves do face real danger. Maybe expand on some of, the risks or issues you faced where either they are injured or fatally injured, and what lessons you drew from the loss of life and people who are even still to date are permanently disabled.
Yeah, it's difficult. We look around and we see what's happening underground, and that call to make is just every incident comes to what you're dealing with. Rescuers do, like I said, push themselves to the boundaries. It is something which is not easy to be said. When do you turn around, or what do you do? If life is at stake, these guys just wants to go forward and they pushes themselves. So high risk for us is illegal mining is becoming a serious issue for us underground.
Sure.
Unfortunately, not all mines have got the means to know how many illegal miners or to manage the situation. So going underground, you don't know what you're going to anticipate. So it is a concern for us at this point in time. Our mines in South Africa are deep mines. Deep mines brings seismicity along.
For sure.
Deep mines brings heat along. If I look at the 41 people that we have lost, most of them has been lost because of heat, where people go in heat exhaustion. We do train our guys to an extensive level of heat. We do a heat tolerance test on them, where we take a rectal temperature thereafter. And unfortunately, if you fail that test, you cannot become a rescuer. So we have adopted to the risks of what we have in South Africa. I also serve on the International Mines Rescue Body. That's a governing body for the world of mines rescue. And our rescue team members go into extreme, if I have to compare to the rest of the world. And it's not merely because they don't want to do that. Their mining methodologies is just slightly different than the conditions we experience in South Africa. But training, policies, procedures, systems of work, all of those comes from the 41 people that have lost their lives. Training methodologies, things we do. All of this comes for the guys that have lost their life. There's also a workload test which these guys go through just to check their physical training and capability, of which they've got 40 minutes to complete. And sometimes people don't complete it. You cannot come back if you cannot pass these stringent training. There's also a claustrophobia test of which we put the guys through a 560 millimeter or 570 millimeter ventilation pipe, which is filled with smoke. We make a real fire in our mock mines and we push the guys through it with their breathing apparatuses. So we try to make it as real as possible during training situations so that when the guys go underground, they do the right things and we make sure that they come out safely.
And I want to touch a bit more to the training, but before that, passion and adrenaline can be so consuming when you are in a moment or situation that matters to you so much. And I think that's the reality of, the Proto members. How do you actively keep or get your guys to make those tough and hard decisions, which are personal life-saving, especially where there's a life, they can see the life, but it's just too dangerous to continue, because I can imagine when that matters to you so much, you can draw those lines. How do you keep getting them to draw back, if it's that even possible?
It's sometimes difficult, sometimes you need to make that hard call to say, guys, I know you want to go for it and I know you want to do it, but you have to step back. And that's where our training personnel, my managers and assistant managers, and even myself have to step in together with mine management to say, guys, let's just take a step back. Let's have a view from outside before we continue. Because even myself and even my guys, I sometimes see when we get into the control room, you start becoming part of the situation which is busy. And that's not our purpose.
That's not your function.
We need to stand out from a bird's view, just looking at it and saying, we're going wrong here, we're going in the right direction. And I think that's something we always have to pull yourself back to say, are we thinking like that, or have we become part of the incident?
Look, your training is notoriously rigorous, both physically and mentally demanding, more than a lot of us can even imagine. What does the training aim to achieve besides the physical fitness?
It's to skill the person and to make the person capable to deal with the scenarios of underground and also above surface, because we only don't just do underground, we also do surface. We've currently now started with the surface fire responders, of which we've got about 720 members that joined us since last year, of which we're training for the industry. So training is important for people to be capable and competent to deal with scenarios. Our training is rigorous, it is difficult, but it's for me to make sure that that person can go down safely, come out safely. He can't put his people that's working with him at risk. If you have one weak member, that weak member puts the other members at risk.
For sure.
It also puts the person to be rescued at risk. So that training is rigorous. And it's sad to say that there's about a 55% failure rate of people that knocks on the door, that wants to give that voluntary service to the industry, that can never make it.
Sure. Is there then a risk of having enough volunteers in the future, even looking at the pass rate? I mean, you say it's only 55% pass. Is there a risk that we might run short because people are just not fit for this kind of work?
We have seen lately that a lot of people falls out because of fitness.
For sure.
But I don't foresee it to be a problem. The training and the methodology and the way we've been doing it for the last 100 years. So it has been even stringenter than what it is today. But I think what came to play nowadays is the health of the rescuer. Whilst he's coming in for training, we do put them on with heart rate monitors so that we can track them whilst we put them through training. And yes, you cannot stand up from the couch and think you're going to be a rescuer tomorrow. And you have to, unfortunately, keep yourself in shape all the time.
Look, in learning about this training, I for sure came to a personal conclusion that some of these requirements, it's either you have it or you don't. I mean, I felt like, because at some point, I think I wanted, to know more with keen interest. But you get to know that it's either you have it or you don't, and there's certain things you just cannot train into a person. Is that a fair observation?
Absolutely. There are some of the parameters you can either do it or you can't do it.
For sure.
Especially like with the heat tolerance. And it's a genetic thing. It's either your body is heat tolerant or not. You cannot go and train and get fit and come back and think you're going to pass the heat tolerance. Claustrophobia, it's a mindset thing.
Yeah.
I've had guys that's been in the brigade for longer than 10 years, and just that one day, he cannot go through claustrophobia, and unfortunately then he needs to walk away. We also have a cut-off age of our guys on 46 years of age.
Oh, okay.
So for underground 46, then you're out.
Sure.
You can then join the surface brigade, but you cannot continue after the age of 46.
How do your rescuers process and deal with emotional distress that comes with this work? And I can imagine when somebody has got to recover bodies, when somebody has got to look into their family's faces and say, I am sorry, that comes with more than what you're trained for. How do they deal with this kind of thing?
I think they realize the day that they sign up for this.
Okay.
I think that first week of initial training, we make them aware to say that you will see things which no other person in the mining industry will ever see in their life. If I have to recall on the things I've seen and I'll close my eyes and I get the back flashes, it's horrific, which I've seen. But you learn to deal with it and you make peace with it to say that I'm putting my hand up, this might come my way, and I need to find a way to deal with it. We do offer the guys counseling afterwards to help make it easier and better. But yes, if you sign up for this work, you're going to see what nobody's ever seen in their life.
Yeah. Look, passion, discipline, and pride are the hallmarks of Proto Team. You see it in how they carry themselves and how they show up in everything they do, besides even the work in the field for mine rescue. Where does that come from?
I think it's an organizational culture. I think it's a culture that has been established by the predecessors over many years. And everybody said, things will change. And I can promise you now, things hasn't changed. It's still the same. But you know what's the nice thing for me? Is when we get together and the guy said to me, you know, this made a difference in my personal life, my family's life.
Sure.
I never had a dad that looked out for me.
Sure.
That's when things comes to play. It makes a difference on a personal level for these rescue team members. And that's what's nice, is that we can not just affect them and the brigade, but the community outside of Mines Rescue Services. That's the nice part about it.
Look, there's enormous pressure that comes with the work that you've got to do, right? There's expectation and pressure coming from the authorities, from the company itself, even from the families that look at you as the only hope. Menace, how do you keep focus and maintain focus even when there is so much noise? Because that's what industry leaders are expected to. There's just always so much noise. The mining industry is highly pressurized. How does a leader maintain focus and order when there's this commotion? How do you do it?
I always say you need to be honest to yourself.
For sure.
If you're not honest to yourself and you don't know to say the right words at the right time, then it starts eating to you. So whatever I try to do is to be as honest as possible, assess the situation, and be upfront with what it is. You know, many times people are under pressure because they know what reality is, but they don't put it out there, and they create false expectations from whatever's outside there. And that's when the pressure starts building up.
Sure.
I mean, looking at the situation and scenario, and with the expertise and knowledge one have over the years of serving, you can easily say which direction this is going and how long it's going to take. And yes, sometimes when you put it on the table, people don't like it what they hear, but you have to prove it. You need to be clear up front to say there's so many tons, there's so many tunnels. This is the situation. This is the resources we have. We foresee this is going to take us a week or 10 days or 50 days or a year later. Because if you don't do that and you say we're going to get it tomorrow, pressure just starts building up because you've created expectation by people. And it's not nice for people out there because there's life at stake, there's emotions at stake, and then they will pressurize you to get the desired outcome. Where if you're upfront, it's not nice, but then at least it's out there to understand what the situation are.
Look, talking about the issue of expectation, the minister just mentioned with the Kapa mine situation that it is probably not likely that the miners are still alive. That is something that it's a one-liner, you hear it, you don't want to hear it again. What's your observation with something like that?
I think you need to be honest and put it as it is. The minister went underground with us. I've dealt with many incidents of which the minister has attended, and this was the first time that he actually went underground. And to honest to say, for all these incidents, you know, I was sitting with the ministry when they talk to the mine and to the people and in the surroundings. And they are the legislator that governs the mines. But when they arrive there, they arrive with empathy and sympathy towards the people that's affected, the communities, the family members, the mine. And they're there to assist and to help, of which I appreciate. They're not just there to come and find out what went wrong immediately. It's a dire situation, and they would do whatever they can to assist to get the issue resolved. So we went underground, and from what he has observed, I mean, he was honest to himself coming out to say, guys, this is a bad situation that we're finding ourselves in as a country. So the likelihood and the possibility, let's face reality. So yes.
Menace, what does leadership look like when lives are on the line?
Yes, I think you need to understand the situation, know what's at stake. But you also need to know that you as a leader are leading this operation, and you cannot be drawn down or drawn into the situation. You need to take an objective view and guide and lead these teams. I think during these incidents, you don't need to tell people what to do.
Yeah.
What I've seen is people they're volunteers. No volunteer will rock up there knowing he can sacrifice his life to go and help people. He's there to help and to apply his knowledge and expertise. You need to allow people to do what they should do. Listen to them because they're there underground. Let them give you advice and then guide the spirit around it. There's nothing you're going to tell them or teach them during that incident. If you haven't done it before, you can't do it. You can't go like in a Springbok game and you want to teach the guys out of the booth how to play rugby or soccer. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You need to trust what you've done before. You're there to build them, listen to them, and put the small pieces together. I take it for when I went underground with the minister. They came out and I said, I want to stay behind. I'll walk out later.
Yeah.
And I stayed behind with purpose to talk to the teams, to hear from the captains, to hear from the workers there. What else can we do? What's frustrating you guys? What's slowing down the process? And I got an honest view from the guys. That's the nice part about it.
Yeah.
Because you're sitting in the control room, you don't hear the finer detail. And I came out and I could share it with the team to say, this is the frustration underground, which we need to sort out.
Sure. Mistakes happen. Bad decisions happen. And I think the unfortunate thing in our case, in the industry, the costs are too high, can be very devastating. How do you navigate around that reality in dealing with mistakes, particularly in how you hold your teams accountable? And also drawing from your experiences where you made mistakes and somebody had to sort of deal with you. How do you navigate around the issue of mistakes?
Yes, you never want to make a mistake, like you say, it's at high cost. You work with people's life and you work with operations. And those two things you need to keep alive. No manager or executive ever in his life wants to lose a person's life or to close a business, because businesses give life to people as well on a different level. But you need to be understandable that you don't know everything. Failing to make mistakes, you need to listen to people around you. It's not a one-man show. You haven't got all the answers and the knowledge to do that. You need to tap into other people's knowledge and expertise and take the best out of that and go forward. And if you did make a mistake, you need to go back, look at that mistake, make peace with it, and carry on. But before you carry on, you need to realize what was the learnings out of that mistake. What else you can do better for you the next time not to make that mistake. You need to take the ownership of it. If you blame that mistake towards somebody else, you haven't taken the ownership. You haven't grown. If there's a mistake, you say, listen, yeah, I made that mistake. These are the learnings that I took from that mistake. This is what I'm going to put in place. This makes me a better person, stronger person going forward. So the ownership of that mistake is the biggest thing that you can do. I've made many mistakes in my life. I'm not sitting here because it was a free sale, I can tell you that. And if any executive says to me, they've never made a mistake, I can't trust, I can't believe you. There's no way. Those mistakes growed me. It made me bigger. It made me understand and made me think different in life. And unfortunately, it came at a price, of which I'm not proud to say, but it made me a better person today. And sometimes in the mining industry, when people make mistakes, you just want to beat them and chase them away and dismiss them.
Yes.
That employee leaves your company with that knowledge and expertise that came at your company's cost. He's moving to a different company, being a stronger person, more knowledgeable. Keep them. Don't just let them go. They've learned from it. See how you can grow them from the mistake they've made.
Look, the reality is a team's performance, results, and culture are a direct reflection on the leader. You have built a remarkable product team. What is the secret?
Being in touch.
Oh, yeah.
Don't think that you're sitting in the office, you're executive. Get yourself boots on, get on the ground, get in touch with the guys, get in touch with the people working for you, the volunteers, hear what their concerns are, and then make the best out of it. I think that's key. Don't think you're just having people working for you and they're employees and they're on the payroll. You need to get in touch with the people to understand what it's all about.
What support would you say the Proto team still requires today? I mean, if you look and reflect on some of the disasters you had to respond to, there's certainly some things that the industry needs to pay urgent attention to and possibly support to be given to you and the team. What would you say that support is currently?
Yes, I think the teams are quite well established in South Africa. We're in a fortunate position. A couple of years back, we were sitting with 880 rescue team members underground. We're sitting close to 1,130. So they've grown quite a lot. So it shows that the industry is supporting having more teams, having the teams fully complement and staffed. So from the mining industry, there's no doubt that they've got full support towards mines rescue services, and we're grateful for that. But what we do note, and we can see it within the teams, is back at the mine itself, is the support from the mine management at the mine level, and the HODs that's working for mine management, the support towards the mines rescue services teams. I know production is pressurizing, and sometimes mines rescue and proto training clashes with that. But I can assure you, you need to understand, if that incident occurs in your section, your people are trapped, the guys will immediately be there to come and rescue and save the people, or to do recovery, or to do firefighting, and to come and assist you in your section. And nobody else is going to come and help you if it's gassed.
For sure.
Only those rescue team members. Give them support, and you will see those teams grow to the best teams in South Africa. I can see it, the teams that's got mine management support on mine level, how they grow and where they are, versus the teams that do not get that support. So I think that's something I would like to leave there.
Sure. Look, the reality is currently the weight of the country is on your shoulders. We are literally looking at menace to come up with something, because we are all praying, we are all thinking what could happen. What would your message of hope be to all South Africans as we sit with hope and anticipation of what will come out in Kimberley?
I think it's to be supportive.
Yeah.
And as much as you can support towards the communities that's affected, the families that's affected, the mine management that's affected. Yes, there are things that's wrong, and there will be an inquiry and investigation thereafter. But I think when things go bad, don't go into a negative spree.
For sure.
It's a lot of pressure on every single person that's busy with that operation. I can assure you that. From the mine management down to the families, down to the community. You know, the Northern Cape is also a close-knit community. Not that I'm saying the other areas are not. But it was quite well taken when I filled up my car at the garage and I climb in, the guy says to me, "How far are you? What's happening there?" And I stop in the next town and I got the same question. I said, "We are busy. I've got guys on the ground and we're busy doing what we have to do." So yes, I think it's the support and the positiveness out there to say, let's see what's going to come from this.
Look, Manas, thank you so much for your insights. And I'm going to tell you, your focus and intentionality as a leader is literally seen right through every proto team member in our operations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm blessed to have so many people under my management. I always say that, you know, most of the guys underground rescue team members are guys, and I'm the father of 1,120 boys. And then also I've became the father of 720 surface fire responder members, of which there's ladies also involved, of which I'm very proud.
I just saw that. I'm like, this is good.
Excellent. So my family is growing.
It is.
And they've got all my support. I mean, wherever we go, my full support is towards my rescue team members, my surface fire responder members, and then also mine management and the public out there. So we'll do whatever we can to make sure people are safe in the mining industry. And if we can recover to give closure to families, that's what we will do.
True. And very last, I think your boys and girls don't always have that direct access to you or that voice spoken to them from you directly. What would you want to say to this powerful, determined team?
My door is always open. I think all of them has got my contact details.
What?
Every now and then I get messages on WhatsApp and on LinkedIn and all other social media platforms. You know, I've had rescue team members during this week checking in. "Sir, just want to check, are you doing well? What's happening? Thank you for leading us." So yes, we are quite in touch with them, and there are avenues for them to reach out to me. Every year we also give acknowledgement on their 5-year service intervals, which we've got a long service awards. And it was nice to see the proto members and the surface fire responder members being at the last functions and all the ladies being there. So yes, we are growing as an organization, and it's nice sitting on this side, seeing what's happening. And it's nice to see that they bought into the culture of discipline, support, and the passion that they show towards what they're doing.
Look, Manas, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Behind every rescue and every deployment, there are people who've made a conscious choice to run towards danger so that others may live. no glory, no prizes, just purpose. That's the Proto team. I hope this episode has given you deeper appreciation of the work that goes behind the scenes in our industry. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye and God bless.